So we need to pursue policies which are right, not which are popular. Compared to other taxes, VAT is the only tax that we can increase and generate more revenue for the government. If the coalition government is able to communicate in a very transparent manner, that to some extent will build confidence.
Bula, and welcome to the Lens at 177. As we speak, we're just a few days away from the announcement of the 2023-2024 national budget, the first for our coalition government. And here to discuss the issue and maybe to shed some light and help our listeners and our readers to better understand what this really means. We have a lecturer from the University of South Pacific, Dr. Janesh Sami.
Bula, thanks for having me.
See you. Dr. Sami is no stranger to the Fiji Times. He's appeared on our front page when he gave a presentation at the recent Pacific Update. So, Dr. Sami, just to help the people of Fiji better understand what the debt level means. A lot of times we hear the words debt level and debt to GDP ratio, and while people see big figures, 90% of debt to GDP, and almost $10 billion in debt. What does that mean? What do those words mean?
Okay, what basically simply means here is that government needs to provide certain services. It needs to invest in health, education, infrastructure, water, and so on. Right? So it's going to raise taxes on certain things.
Yes.
That is necessary to generate revenue to finance these kinds of expenditure. But sometimes there's a gap between revenue and expenditure,
right,
which means the government has to borrow either from domestic sources or from international market.
Okay.
If you look at our debt, as of January 2023, it stands around 9.5 billion.
Right, which is a big thing.
Which is a substantially higher number for a small Pacific Island country. Now, if you want to look at that, we need to take a step backwards and look at what has changed over the years.
Right.
In 2006, our debt was about $2.8 billion.
Right.
Right? So over the span of about 16 years,
yes,
it has gone up to about 9.5 billion, which is about an increase of $6.7 billion.
Right.
Now let's look at that $6.7 billion and see what it has got us. Very important for us to understand that even though our debt level has gone up, that has not generated the type of economic growth that we ideally desired.
Right.
The average growth rate over the last 10 years has been around 3%.
Okay.
The average growth rate over the period 2015 to 2019 has been about 3%. So one of the very serious issue here is that even though we have been borrowing,
yes,
that has not provided sustained economic growth. That's the first issue. The second issue is that borrowing has not led to reduction in poverty.
right, yes,
And post-COVID poverty rate has actually gone up. Right. The other issue is that borrowing has not promoted economic activity. That has actually brought youth unemployment down.
right,
So the youths are frustrated with the lack of job opportunities, and many are migrating. So ideally, if you are looking at debt, you don't want to look at debt alone. You'd want to look at what debt has led to. What are the positive as well as the negative effects?
Any positive? Is there any positive?
It has allowed the government to stay in power in the sense that it has allowed to spend on necessary areas.
Yeah.
But what we see from an economist perspective is that if you're borrowing, that should finance or that should support our economic growth, because when the economy is growing rapidly, even though you're borrowing, it improves your capacity to pay back.
Right.
Now we have a debt of about 9.5 billion as of January 2023.
Right.
That's about 85% of the GDP.
Yes.
The question that we must answer now is, can we continue on that path, or we need to do something different? That's the bigger question. Because one of the things that we need to understand is, as a small island economy, over the next 10 years, will become more vulnerable to natural disasters.
Right. Yes.
So if we have another natural disaster like Cyclone Winston, that will have a massive impact on our GDP. That will make us vulnerable to, all sort of other problems in the economy, which will make it very important for the government to borrow.
Yes.
Increase our borrowing substantially.
Right.
So now we want to put our economy on a more sustainable path. This is very, very important. The other issue is that what were the spending like? When the government is spending money on certain projects, these funds need to be spent in a very wise manner.
Right.
For example, if you look at TELS in a way is a good thing because people are getting educated. But there are a number of issues with TELS. One, not everyone who studies under TELS gets a job.
Yes.
Right? The other issue is some graduates are in other professions, not in the field that they studied.
Right.
So there's a mismatch happening. So the third issue there is that the amount of money that we're recovering from TELS is not sustainable. So if you have a debt of around $621 million,
right,
and every year you are getting only $5 million back,
yes,
right? It's not sustainable.
right,
And I understand that the poor and the vulnerable, they're concerned about TELS.
yes,
But any government cannot just have a scheme, that's not sustainable.
yes,
So we need to pursue policies which are right, not which are popular.
okay,
And that's the major challenge for the coalition government, to look at where we are spending, where we can minimize wastage. And it has to undertake reforms on the expenditure side, not necessarily expenditure cut.
okay,
Same thing when you talk about the sugar industry. We need to revive the sugar industry because you're looking at, about quarter population that's dependent on the industry.
right,
So the key challenge there for the government is to look at what are the different areas where we are providing support to the farmers, where are the failures happening, where are the challenges, where can we make some interventions. So when I'm saying expenditure reform, I'm not saying you cut expenditure. I'm saying look at where the wastage is happening. That needs to be fixed. And this is very important because we cannot continue on that path. The other thing which the government needs to do is to point out this very clearly to the public.
yes,
It needs to identify where is the wastage happening across all ministries or all sectors, and communicate this clearly to the taxpayers,
right,
because that is going to build confidence of these people. Because we have to do a lot. The coalition government has to fix a lot of issues in the health sector, in the education sector, in the sugar industry, infrastructure, and so on. It has a lot to do, but the challenge is you have very limited resources.
right,
Now, if you compare this with the previous government,
right,
in 2006, our debt was less than 3 billion.
right,
So the Bainimarama government had that scope to spend.
and they did it,
And they did it. And that kind of supported growth to some extent.
yes,
And then it was able to borrow. Now we have a high debt ratio.
right,
It will be very difficult for us to spend. We can spend, but we have to do it in a very wise, sustainable manner.
okay. But we understand the coalition government has to tighten their belt,
Right.
so to speak. But for the ordinary person on the street, on one hand, government is saying prepare for a bit tough times.
Yeah.
Not hard times, just tough times. But they see them driving around in air-conditioned vehicles,
Right.
traveling overseas on trips, and it's hard for them to understand. You're telling us to tighten our belt,
Right.
while you're living a high life. There's also that perception
Yes.
that needs to change.
Yes, I agree. So I think a couple of weeks ago, I talked about communication policy.
Yes,
There will be a lot of misinformation happening around.
That's
That is my understanding. And that is something that we cannot avoid totally. If the coalition government is able to communicate in a very transparent manner,
yes,
that to some extent will build confidence. And I recently read the news, that the Prime Minister Sidhwani Rambuka actually cleared the confusion that he went to US
Yes.
and that was financed by someone from US. It was not on taxpayers' funds. So those kinds of, information being released in the public can build confidence.
Right.
The government needs to be more transparent about spending.
Right.
And I think the coalition government is also looking at the salaries being paid to the parliamentarians.
Right.
So those things build confidence. That's very, very important.
Right.
But again, the government has to take a very balanced approach. The burden of whatever policy changes that will be recommended has to be shared across different sectors.
Okay.
The more transparent the government is,
Yes.
the better the people will be able to trust the government.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. When we come back from the short break, we'll speak to Dr. Sami about another interesting subject, VAT.
We were around when the deed was first signed. We were around when the first car engine roared. We were around when the very first was crowned. Through devastations, jubilant celebrations, and the milestones. We will continue to be around to bring you all the stories first.
Welcome back to The Lens at 177. We're having a really interesting discussion with lecturer in economics at the University of the South Pacific, Dr. Janesh Sami. And Dr. Sami, your thoughts about VAT? Could you just share that with us?
Let me start by saying that whenever you talk about VAT increase, it's always going to be a very difficult discussion. Right? Prior to the election, one of the very difficult discussions that we were having about cost of living.
Yes.
So obviously the poor and the vulnerable expect the coalition government to reduce cost of living.
Yes.
Right? So a big part of that would be VAT. Now the challenge for the coalition government is how to actually make upward changes in the VAT rate while at the same time minimizing the adverse impact on cost of living.
All right.
Some recommendations have been made about what should be the increase in VAT, and I think the Fiscal Review Committee has made a recommendation of 12.5 to 15% max. But if you look at the VAT that we are paying, and people can actually verify themselves, on certain items we are paying 15%,
Yes.
on certain items we are paying 9%. Right? I mean, we can look at the receipt that we get from the cashier and see we are paying 9%, 15%.
Right.
So, considering the cost of living crisis that we are having, I think if you have a moderate increase somewhere between 10 to 12%,
Right.
that's the recommended range. The impact on the poor and the vulnerable will not be significant because we're already paying 9%.
Right.
On certain items. So if you're having 10% to 12%, the impact on the poor will not be that significant.
Right.
Now people also need to understand why are we focusing on VAT.
Yeah.
Compared to other taxes, VAT is the only tax that we can increase and generate more revenue for the government. So if you're looking at personal income tax, corporate tax, departure tax, right? This will not give us as much revenue as we can get from VAT.
Right.
So if you're looking at the public services, let's say the health sector, if you're looking at water and other issues that people are really concerned about,
Right.
if you really want to fix that, the government needs the revenue.
Yes.
So VAT is where we can have more gains in terms of revenue.
Right.
But the government should be considerate about that, and any increase in VAT should be accompanied by necessary reforms in the social protection. So I would recommend the government to keep VAT increase to somewhere between 10 to 12%.
Right.
Now let me take this opportunity to clear some misconfusions about VAT. Whenever you increase VAT, it will have some positive impact on inflation.
Yes.
But the impact of VAT increase on consumer price index will not be immediate.
Okay. How so?
That means it takes time. Policies operate with lag.
Right.
So the consumers, the supermarkets, they'll take time to adjust their behavior.
Right.
So the impact of VAT increase on consumer price index or inflation will not be immediate, which means the coalition government has a window of opportunity, and that's why last week or so I suggested to the government that let's have an independent analysis of inflation.
Right.
What is happening to inflation? How can we bring cost of living down? Right. That's one way. So research done in 1990s
Yes.
actually pointed out that when you increase VAT, the prices will actually go up after 2 years.
Okay.
Right, roughly about 2 years. Right. That was done in 1990s.
Yes.
Things might have changed, but still policies will operate with a lag.
Right.
But within that period of time, we can do some research to better find out. And I think the fiscal review report that we have, which was produced in a very short period of time, quite comprehensive, gives us a window of opportunity. We can do a similar kind of research to look at cost of living crisis. Right? Let's move away from the days where we talk, imported inflation, we can't do much about it.
Right.
Right? The people of this country expects the coalition government to bring cost of living down.
Yes.
And if the coalition government is able to work in that direction, this will build more confidence in the government. The other aspect which I want to point out, when you increase VAT, it might have some negative impact on consumption and investment.
Yes.
That was done, this is based on a study that was done in 2003. Now, things have changed. Now we are receiving over $1 billion of remittances. So with more remittances flowing, that will have a positive impact on consumption.
Yes.
Right? So that's going to have an offsetting impact. If the budget is able to provide the right kinds of indications to the private sector, investment activity will pick up. So consumption and investment can actually go up even though you have a mild increase or moderate increase in VAT. My suggestion is keep any increase in VAT moderate. 15% will be too much.
Yes.
It will seriously undermine the confidence people have in, and let people adjust to it.
Yes.
And within the next year, then you can say, okay, we increased VAT by a certain amount. These were the effects. Okay. Now we can consider a change or not. Let's take a phase approach so the poor and the vulnerable are protected.
Right. Thank you for that. I think one issue is the zero rated items.
Yes.
So there's no VAT on those items.
Yes.
And if that will suddenly be hit by, say, a 12 or 10% VAT,
right,
that will have an impact.
Okay.
Wouldn't you think, on the low income?
Right. So let me just point out here that we are losing about $160 million on that VAT exemption. Right. So here is a challenge. If you remove that, the poor and the vulnerable are going to suffer.
Right.
Right. And right now that may not be the right time.
Yes.
We don't want to do that now.
Yes.
Let's consider that in future budgets.
Right.
Because we have a cost of living crisis in this country.
Yes.
And I think it would be very appropriate for the government to keep that VAT exemptions now.
Right.
Maybe they could consider, looking at what is all included in that basket. Right. That's one way to look at. But for now, I would recommend the government to keep the exemptions.
Yes.
Yeah. And later on, you might want to revise that.
Right.
Because that's directly going to affect the poor and the vulnerable.
Yeah.
And when you're releasing the first budget, since you're forming the government,
yes,
and you remove that, the poor and the vulnerable are going to be very, very seriously affected, and that's not the ideal way to go forward.
Some people might refer to it as political suicide to do something.
Yes, yes.
Just say, for argument's sake, the government decides no more zero rated, we'll put 10% or whatever the VAT they've decided on. How then should there's some talk of direct cash injections, but you and I both know what happens when you give people direct cash injections.
Yes.
The bottle shops
Yes.
sell out their beer.
Yes.
People don't spend the money on food.
Yes.
It's more spent on alcohol, grog and cigarettes.
Yes.
That's the reality. So how else can we provide those assistance in a way that it'll be used correctly?
Okay, so one way to look at that is if you are providing assistance, it's very difficult to regulate. Where does that money end up in?
Yes.
So for the short term measure is to retain that VAT exemption.
Right.
And over the time you would want to extend it. You'd want to look at what all comes under that basket.
Yes.
The other thing which I wanted to point out is where FCCC comes in.
Yes.
FCCC might have to be more innovative in terms of how compliance is across the supermarket.
Yes.
Where are the existing loopholes? How are the supermarkets, manipulating the system?
Right.
I mean, what is actually happening? Where are the loopholes? Where can be the interventions be made by the government?
Right.
So that's one area. FCCC, I'm not saying FCCC goes hard on the supermarkets, I'm not saying that, but FCCC needs to relook at what is happening to compliance,
yes.
Where are the existing loopholes,
Yes.
and if that can be improved at. So that's one way.
way.
But right now at this stage I wouldn't recommend the government to do away with the VAT exemptions. Let's keep it reasonable for the poor and then we can improvise over time.
Thank you. Dr. Sami's thoughts on VAT, and I think a lot of people would agree with not doing away with zero rated items. We'll be right back after just a short break.
We were around when the deed was first signed. We were around when the first car engine roared. We were around when the very first was crowned. Through devastations, jubilant celebrations, and the milestones. We will continue to be around to bring you all the stories first.
Welcome back to The Lens at 177. We've been discussing VAT with lecturer at the University of the South Pacific, Dr. Janesh Sami, and had some interesting talk about how VAT and whether we should impose VAT on zero-rated items. So, what could be some impacts, Dr. Sami, if we with people who are unable to afford just basic food items? So what are some of the impacts?
Right. So if you have a very massive increase, large increase in VAT rate, one of the negative implications of that will people will tend to cheaper imports, which may not be necessarily healthy.
Right.
And that can actually have an impact on the incidence of NCDs. Right. So the government has to be mindful of that.
Yes.
And we have a health sector that's already in a mess.
Yes.
There's so much pressure on the health sector. Right. We have a massive migration taking place of medical professionals. Right. So you would really want to have a moderate increase in VAT because you don't want more unhealthy people.
Yes. And Dr. Sami spoke at the recent Pacific update, and one thing that caught our attention was you used the words government should have a realistic budget.
Yes.
Well, what do you mean by realistic budget?
Realistic budget can be interpreted in a number of ways. What I mean by that is the government needs to look at its revenue side.
Yes.
Look at its existing revenue policies and see which ones are realistic, which ones are appropriate at this time.
Right.
We are losing about 24% of our total tax revenue due to tax exemptions. Okay. About 140,000 people do not pay any income tax. Now, question is, can we afford that now?
These are the people below the threshold, the 30,000 threshold?
Yes, 140,000 do not pay income tax. Now, is that something that needs to be changed? We have to be realistic. No one wants to pay more tax.
Right.
But the government needs to get revenue from somewhere.
Yes.
It cannot increase VAT substantially. It can't do that.
Right.
So the government needs to look at its revenue policies. Mm-hmm. Revenue is where there is more scope. It needs to look at how it's collecting revenue. So FRCS needs to do things differently. It needs to identify what are the existing issues with compliance, where are the existing loopholes, what they are doing differently. And this is something they need to communicate clearly to the taxpayers. Right, so the revenue policies need to be more closely aligned with what we want to do now and where we want to take the country forward. On the expenditure side, the challenge for the coalition government is to look across different ministries and identify where has the wastage taken place, where have we wasted money,
Yes.
okay, why has this wastage taken place, what's the reason behind it,
Right.
what policies need to be changed.
Right.
And I think if you look at the first 6 months of this government, it has not fired people in a very rapid pace.
Yes.
It has been, it has been very democratic in the sense, so people stay same,
Yes.
policies stay same, outcomes won't change.
Right.
So what the coalition government can do here is, it can look at its expenditure policy, the existing financial policies,
Right.
and see which financial policies can be changed.
Right.
Can we better manage the expenditure at ministry level,
Yes.
right? So to minimize wastage. Where is any duplication
Right.
taking place? Can that be avoided?
Right.
Can things be better coordinated across ministries? These things need to be looked at. Also, the coalition government needs to identify why this wastage took place. You need to know, we have to learn from the past
Right.
and how that can be avoided. And whatever remedial measures that the government is putting in place to minimize wastage, it needs to be communicated to the public, to the taxpayers.
Again, we come back to communication.
Yes, because that's going to tell the taxpayers, the poor and the vulnerable, this is a government that's minimizing taxpayers' funds.
Right.
And that will improve the political image, economic and political image, and build confidence. That's very, very important, because this is the first year of government.
Yes.
This is that people become more confident in the government, because some of the policies which the government has to pursue over the next few years, it will not be very popular.
Right.
It can't be very popular, and that's what I pointed out sometimes back, that our days of freebies,
Yes.
and generous tax giveaways are over,
Right.
because it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable.
Right.
We have health sector underfunded by about $150 million.
Right.
So it's not surprising when you go to the hospital, the equipments are not working,
Yeah.
there's no doctor there. So we need to fix all that.
Right. Right. But you are saying that the previous Minister of Economy
Yes.
and the former Attorney General would say otherwise. He said they were doing very well, and this was the best government that Fiji has ever had. That's his comments, not mine. So what can this government do to actually make things better? Well, people are saying 6 months on, they haven't seen much change.
Right.
So are we expecting too much?
Okay, that's one thing that let's get this right. This government has been in power for 6 months, right? And it has taken very useful positive steps, right? You can talk about GCC, right? You can talk about Gilmet Day, you can talk about economic summit, and you'll be happy about the repealing of the draconian media laws.
Yeah.
That's 6 months, right? This budget is bigger opportunity to look at the economic policies.
Right.
Right? The problem is, over the last 16 years, right, the previous government had the scope to spend,
Right.
and then borrow.
Right.
That was what was happening in the past. Now we can't keep on borrowing, because our debt is already at $9.5 billion.
Right.
So our debt ratio is about 85% of GDP.
Right.
It might have come down slightly down, but our scope to keep on borrowing is very limited.
Yes.
We can't do that.
Right.
If you want to borrow domestically, the big burden will fall on FNPF.
FNPF.
So the government can spend, but the government has to spend in a sustainable way.
Yes.
So that's very important, and that's why I said that you have to pursue the right policies,
Yes.
not popular policies.
Right.
And so basically, days of freebies and over generous tax giveaways, government has to really look at on the revenue side.
Right.
Where are we losing revenue?
Right. Yes.
Can we look at that? At least get some revenue from that side.
Right.
If we're able to get $200 million, we could basically double the amount that we're paying to the social welfare recipients.
Right.
Because we're spending about $125 million on social welfare.
Right. At the moment.
Right. So where are we losing revenue? And I think My understanding is that I am hoping that Ministry of Economy along with FRCS, they have done some sound analysis to identify where are we losing revenue and what are some of the things that will change in this budget so we can actually tap on those revenue.
Thank you, Dr. Sami.
We were around when the deed was first signed. We were around when the first car engine roared. We were around when the very first was crowned. Through devastations, jubilant celebrations, and the milestones. We will continue to be around to bring you all the stories first.
Welcome back to the Lens at 177. We've been having a very, very enlightening conversation with Dr. Janesh Sami from the University of the South Pacific, where he's a lecturer in economics. Dr. Sami, we would like to, and I think Fiji would like to hear some ideas on how government could attract more revenue, while at the same time ensure that the poor and the vulnerable are not too adversely affected.
Okay, so the first part of that, I think I've slightly answered that.
Yes.
That keep any increase in VAT to a moderate rate.
Right.
That's one. The second area that the government can look at is to have a massive reform on the social protection programs.
Right.
Which means probably the government could consider, increasing the amount that we're paying to the poor and the vulnerable.
Right.
That will help them with the cost of living crisis.
Yes.
The other thing the government can do is to improve targeting.
Right.
We target people who are actually poor.
Right.
So if you're actually seriously poor, you get money from the government. So improve targeting.
Yes.
The third area which the government can look at is how we can strengthen the data and information system.
Right.
Because once you're able to have a proper profile on poor and the vulnerable, you can assist them in a more effective manner.
Right.
So if you're increasing VAT, keep it at a moderate rate.
Yes.
Reform the social protection programs.
Yes.
So we are effectively able to help the poor and the vulnerable.
Those who are really poor.
Right. And then the other area is to focus on economic growth.
Right.
The reason why we have to focus on economic growth is because when economy grows, it also generates revenue for the government.
Right.
Now the question is, how do you support economic growth?
Yes.
A big part of that could be from SMEs.
Right.
SMEs, they are a very important component of our economy now.
Yes.
Right? So I'm hoping that in this particular budget, the government come up with some real solid policies to support growth of SMEs.
Right.
The other area which the budget could possibly look at is how you are supporting economic empowerment,
Right.
how you are looking at economic diversification,
Yes.
how you are supporting rural development. All these things will drive economic growth.
Right.
Okay, and whatever reforms you are having on the private sector side, that will also support economic growth. So with higher economic growth, your revenue will improve. People are going to spend. First of all, people will get jobs, right? So high economic growth will create job opportunities, and people will spend money. That will mean more revenue for the government. So that's one way to look at it. But again, I would want to point out here that not everything should be on VAT. It has to what the government needs is a mix of policies.
Yes. When you mentioned targeting, does that mean how do we know how many people? Is there a way to measure the people that are not who should not be receiving social?
So that's where the relevant ministry comes in.
Right.
It needs to have a well-developed data and information system on those who are receiving the assistance from the government.
Right.
So if we have a well-developed data system, we can target and we can assist more effectively.
Right.
So I'm hoping if the government is, let's say, increasing VAT, that is accompanied by necessary reforms in the social reform programs.
Okay. Well, there you have it. That's wonderful insights from Dr. Janesh Sami. And we hope to actually invite him back on the Lens at 177 after the budget is delivered on Friday. And Dr. Sami, on behalf of the Fiji Times, thank you for joining us on the program.
Thanks for having me.
And don't forget to log on to our Facebook and YouTube channels. Just visit our channels and see a wonderful content that we have there for you, including this interview. And visit our website, www.fijitimes.com. Vinaka.